The year was 1763, and the air in the 13 colonies was thick with tension, though most of the colonists did not yet fully understand the storm that was gathering. Across the vast Atlantic, the British crown was weary but triumphant. Having just emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, the war had drained Britain's treasury, but it had also expanded its empire in North America, leaving the British government with enormous new territories to manage and defend. To the people of London, the colonies seemed ripe with opportunity, but to those who lived in Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, the Crown's intentions were far less benevolent. As settlers pushed further westward, into lands claimed by Native Americans and now under British control, the government issued the Proclamation of 1763. It was a document meant to calm the frontier, forbidding colonists from settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains. On paper, it was a protective measure meant to prevent bloody conflicts with native tribes. But to the colonists, it felt like a leash, a sudden, invisible boundary imposed by a distant king thousands of miles away. Families who had dreamed of fertile farmland to the west were now barred from pursuing their livelihoods. Traders and land speculators seethed in quiet anger, feeling their ambitions crushed by a distant authority that seemed blind to the realities of life in the colonies. Murmurs of resentment began to stir in taverns and town squares, and for many, this was just the beginning. It wasn't long before Britain's financial demands added fuel to the growing fire. The government, desperate to replenish its coffers, turned to the colonies with new taxes. The first of these was the Stamp Act of 1765, a law that required colonists to pay a tax on every piece of printed paper they used: legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. The principle seemed simple to London. If the colonies benefited from British protection during the recent war, they should help pay for it. But the colonists saw it as an outrage. They had no representation in Parliament, and suddenly they were expected to shoulder the cost of decisions made by men who had never set foot in America. The phrase "no taxation without representation" began to echo through the streets, from Boston to Charleston, capturing a growing sense of injustice that would soon become a rallying cry for resistance. The reactions were swift and dramatic. Merchants boycotted British goods, refusing to buy tea, paper, and other imported items. In Boston, a group of men calling themselves the Sons of Liberty emerged as leaders of organized protest. Their methods were bold and sometimes violent. Effigies of tax collectors were hanged from trees, houses of officials were ransacked, and ships carrying British goods were turned away from ports. Ordinary colonists, once passive subjects, were now active participants in a growing rebellion. Fear and excitement mingled in the air. No one could predict where this defiance might lead, but everyone could feel the tension coiling like a spring. The British government, unmoved by the protests, responded with further assertion of power. The Declaratory Act of 1766 was passed quietly, almost in a whisper, but its message was thunderous. Parliament had the authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Britain was not retreating. It was reaffirming its control. For the colonists, the act was a chilling reminder that the Crown considered them subjects, not partners in governance. The sense of alienation deepened. Every edict from London now felt like a provocation, and every act of defiance from the colonies was a challenge that could escalate into open confrontation. Tensions escalated further in 1767 with the introduction of the Townshend Acts, a series of taxes on imported goods such as glass, paint, paper, and tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, these taxes were designed to be less visible, included in the price of goods rather than a separate fee. But the colonists were not deceived. Across the colonies, merchants again protested, and women played a critical role by leading boycotts. Producing homespun cloth to reduce dependence on British imports, cities became hotbeds of resistance, with pamphlets and newspapers spreading ideas of liberty and fairness. In Boston, a city already simmering with resentment, the atmosphere grew thick with suspicion and fear. Every British officer, every loyalist official seemed a potential threat to the fragile peace that hung over the streets like a shadow. The tension finally erupted on a cold March night in 1770. A crowd of angry colonists gathered near the customs house in Boston, jeering and throwing snowballs at the soldiers stationed there. The British troops, already nervous in this hostile environment, responded with confusion and fear. A shot rang out no one could say from where exactly. Chaos ensued. By the time the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead, and the city was stunned. The Boston Massacre, as it would be forever remembered, became a symbol of British oppression and colonial outrage. The event was seized upon by leaders like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, who circulated dramatic engravings depicting the soldiers as ruthless murderers firing into an unarmed crowd. The massacre galvanized public opinion, uniting people across class and occupation in a shared sense of injustice. Throughout these years, from the Proclamation of 1763 to the Boston Massacre of 1770, the relationship between Britain and its colonies had changed fundamentally. What had begun as distant governance gradually transformed into direct confrontation. Ordinary colonists, farmers, merchants, artisans, and women found themselves drawn into a struggle that questioned the very nature of authority and allegiance. The tension was palpable. An invisible wire stretched taut across towns and cities, threatening to snap at the slightest provocation. Each new law from Parliament, each act of defiance from the colonies, was a spark thrown onto a dry tinderbox, and all who lived in this era sensed the danger without fully understanding its scope. The seeds of rebellion had been planted deep within the hearts of the colonists. They were not yet ready to declare independence, but the path was forming beneath their feet, each step fueled by outrage, fear, and the relentless human desire for freedom. What had once been a distant, abstract grievance had become personal, tangible, and urgent. Families whispered in kitchens about the unfairness of taxation. Merchants plotted boycotts in dimly lit backrooms, and secret societies, like the Sons of Liberty, operated in shadows, careful yet daring, testing the limits of British authority. By 1770, the colonies were simmering, caught between obedience and rebellion. The British government remained confident in its power, dismissing colonial protests as temporary inconveniences. Yet, in towns like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, ordinary people were learning that their collective voice could wield influence. That courage and defiance could change the course of events. The stage was set for a drama that would grow in intensity, a conflict that would stretch across years and generations. The crisis had begun, and the question that lingered in every tavern, classroom, and home was simple yet terrifying. How far would the colonists go to defend their rights? And how far would Britain push them before the fragile thread of peace broke forever? And so, the seeds of revolution took root. What seemed like small acts, protests, boycotts, pamphlets, and riots were in fact the first tremors of an unstoppable movement. The colonies were no longer content to be passive subjects of a distant empire. They were awakening to the idea that their destiny might, and perhaps must, be determined by their own hands. The tension, the fear, and the simmering anger were all part of a story that would soon explode onto the world stage, reshaping the very notion of government, liberty, and power.